Today we examine the best chess strategy to dominate the entire board using just 2 knights, a strategy that changed how we understand positional play in chess. This idea is brilliantly employed by Herman Pilnik against none other than the former world champion Max Euwe. So let's see how 2 knights can paralyze an entire army without even crossing the center of the board. Euwe starts with d4 and Pilnik wants to play the Grünfeld defense. He replies with knight f6, c4, g6. Now if white makes the standard move knight c3, black replies with d5, after which the Grünfeld defense arises. And it seems that Euwe didn't feel like playing the main line of the Grünfeld defense, so instead of knight c3, he plays g3, preparing the fianchet of the bishop and delaying the development of the queen's knight. We will see the idea of this system now. Black plays d5, and after the exchange of the pawns, both sides fianchet to the bishops and Euwe attacks the knight. And had the white knight been on c3, black of course would have exchanged the pair of knights. But now that the knight hasn't been developed, black must spend a tempo and retreat. So black didn't manage to exchange the pair of knights. Black loses a tempo, and black's position is a little bit cramped. So white has the space advantage, he dominates the center, black has little space and a lot of pieces. So it might be difficult to maneuver all these pieces within this little space. So white now must develop the king side, and knight f3 looks like the most natural move, but in this case black can reply with bishop g4, pinning the knight, which might be quite unpleasant. The knight must defend the pawn, but now it's pinned and black puts a lot of pressure on this pawn. For this reason, instead of knight f3, Euwe develops the knight on e2. Now, of course, bishop g4 doesn't make much sense because that would run into f3. And Pilnik attacks the center with c5, threatening to capture on d4. Of course, it makes no sense for white to capture on c5, because he wins a pawn only temporarily. Black would have exchanged the queens, white loses the right to castle, and after knight d7, black would get back the pawn and completely equalize. For this reason, instead of capturing the pawn, Euwe pushes the pawn forward, crossing the center of the board and increasing his space advantage. The pawn is very strong, putting pressure on black's position and restricting him. So what's on black's mind? Now we will see. After both sides, first black, then white castles, black plays e6. And now we can see the idea. Black is going to exchange on d5, and after white recaptures, white's pawn would become isolated on d5. Euwe develops the knight. Of course, black could have captured on d5 right away, and after e takes d, we can see now black's idea. On the one hand, the pawn is very strong, it still puts pressure on black's position. On the other hand, it's isolated and the white pieces are tied to its defense. But Pilnik doesn't hurry with this capture. Instead, first he develops the knight. Of course, developing the knight on d7 would be a mistake, because the knight would have closed the bishop's diagonal and white would have captured, after which black's pawn structure would be damaged. So instead of knight d7, Pilnik develops the knight on a6. And Euwe plays knight f4, increasing the pressure on e6. Now again he threatens to capture on e6, damaging black's pawn structure. So black must do something about this threat. And of course he could have parried the threat by simply capturing on d5. But instead, Pilnik has another idea on his mind. He pushes the pawn forward with a tempo, attacking the knight, which at first sight might seem like a positional mistake, because after the e5 advance, black lets his opponent get a protected passed pawn. The d5 pawn is a passed pawn and it's protected by the e pawn. And it was considered for many years, it was believed, as Euwe writes in his book, that having a protected passed pawn is always an advantage. But as this game shows, not always. Sometimes this possession is a dubious one. And let's see why. So the white knight must retreat, and we have reached our first critical position. So why did Pilnik let his opponent get the protected passed pawn? You can pause the video and try to find his strategic idea. So by pushing the pawn forward, black blockaded the e-pawn. Now this white pawn cannot move forward. That means the d6 square is a great blockading square. And best blockaders are knights, as even Nemcovich much earlier, before this game, used to teach us. And we will see why knights are best blockaders a little bit later. So the knight, if the knight occupies this square, then the protected passed pawn loses its worth, as we will see. So black can reroute his knight to this square just in 2 moves. Knight c4, preparing knight d6. And it seems that Euwe didn't feel the danger of his position. If he did, he would have challenged black's idea by playing knight b5, taking this square under control. Now, if black plays knight d6 right away, that would be a dubious decision, because white would have exchanged, black would be forced to recapture with the queen, and instead of the knight, black would get the queen as a blockader. But queens are the worst blockaders, because it's very easy to kick the queen out of this square by just attacking her, after which the pawn will move forward. For this reason, if Euwe played the strongest move, knight b5, instead of immediate knight d6, black could have tried knight c7, for example, in order to exchange the knights and then play knight d6. But in this case, white could have tried queen d3, attacking the knight. Again, if the knight moves to d6, white would simply exchange the knights. So the best move for black would be knight takes b5, after which white captures, attacking both the knight and the pawn. The knight cannot move to d6 because the pawn would fall. So black can play knight d4. Now the pawn is untouchable because the white knight is under attack. And white can exchange the knights, after which the symmetrical position would have arisen. But Euwe didn't feel all this, didn't feel the danger of his position. Otherwise he would have played knight b5, which I have just shown. Instead he plays b3, kicking out the knight. But the knight was going to leave this square anyways. So now the knight moves to d6, to the ideal blockading square. And now we can see why knights are the best blockaders. Let's imagine there is a black queen or a rook or a bishop on this square. What would these pieces do besides blockading the d-pawn? Nothing. But the knight controls the very important squares and puts pressure on the enemy position. So black's plan, black actually has 2 possible plans. He has the pawn majority on the queen side, 3 pawns against the 2 pawns. So one of his plans is to push the pawns forward, b5, c4, preparing this advance, and the knight controls both of these crucial squares. So the knight will support the advance of the pawn majority. Besides that, black might also think about the counterplay on the king side. So f5 break is possible. And again, the knight will support this advance. Besides that, together with the f pawn after f5, the knight will also put pressure on the e4 pawn. So the knight, for this reason, the knight is a great blockader, and it isn't easy to attack it, to kick it out. So the d pawn operates as a shield, so white cannot attack the knight on the d file. Besides that, the knight cannot be attacked by the enemy knight, because the b5 square, for example, is controlled by this knight. If white plays knight b5, black would simply capture it. So that's why this knight is very strong. And white already struggles to find an active plan. So Euwe plays bishop a3, eyeing the c5 pawn, which is defended only by the knight. Pilnik plays b6, defending the pawn, untying his knight, and vacating the a6 square for his bishop. Later in the game, the bishop might move to a6, putting pressure on this diagonal. Queen d2. It might seem that white prepares bishop h6, but actually that would be in black's favor. Pilnik plays rook e8, and again, it might seem that rook e8 is the prophylaxis against bishop h6. So black has moved the rook away, so that if white plays bishop h6, black can reply with bishop h8, avoiding the exchange of the bishops. But actually, if white played bishop h6, black would have gladly exchanged the bishops, because that would be in his favor. Of course, the dark squares would be weakened, but white doesn't have the sufficient attacking resources to exploit this. And black's bishop was bad anyways. It was restricted by its own pawn. And white bishop was good. While now, after this exchange, white remains with a bad bishop, restricted by its own pawns, against black's good light-squared bishop. Then what's the idea behind rook e8, you might wonder? It has a different idea. White's only possible active plan, now that his passed pawn is blockaded, is f4. That's the only break white has. And rook e8 was a prophylaxis against this. Now after f4, black might, first, the e5 pawn would be defended by the rook and the bishop, and second, black can even think about capturing on f4, after which not only the bishop's diagonal would open, but also the rook's file will open and the e4 pawn will fall under the rook's attack. So what should white do? The only active plan he has is f4. And if he doesn't play f4, the only thing left for him would be just to employ a waiting strategy and to defend passively. For example, as Euwe writes, probably the best thing he could have done in the anticipation of b5, c4 and f5 breaks would be f3, trying to reinforce his king side on the one hand, and also that would be followed by possible rook f2, bishop f1, and the bishop from f1 would control this diagonal, trying to prevent the black pawn majority on the queen side from moving forward. But it seems that Euwe didn't feel like playing passively, defending passively, so he executes his only active idea. He pushes the f-pawn forward, although black has just taken measures against it by playing rook e8. But let's see what happens next. It turns out that black cannot capture on f4 right away. That would be a strategic mistake, because white would have captured with the pawn, of course, to regain control over the crucial e5 square. Now his pawn controls this square, and there isn't much black can do to prevent the e-pawn from moving forward, after which the knight would be kicked out, the blockade would be broken, and the pawns would simply, the white pawns would destroy everything on their way. For this reason, capturing on f4 right away would be a mistake, and Pilnik simply plays knight c7. The knight wasn't doing much on a6, and he also probably prepares bishop a6. And it turns out that white cannot actually continue his active play on the king side. Indeed, what can he do? f5 doesn't work, because the f5 square is under black's control. Again, we can see the power of the knight. F takes e would also be in black's favor, because after the disappearance of the black e-pawn, the bishop's diagonal would open, the rook's file would open, both of these pieces would become very active, and the white pawn would still be blockaded. So, Euwe doesn't have an active plan. For this reason, in the anticipation of possible bishop a6, which would put pressure on this diagonal and pin the knight, Euwe moves the rook away from this diagonal, rook f2. But now we reach our next critical position. Rook f2 has a serious drawback. And you can pause the video and try to find a tactical idea by which Pilnik exploits this drawback. After rook f2, the a1 rook is unguarded. The rook on f1 used to defend it. Now it doesn't. So Pilnik exploits this. Thanks to this, now he can capture on f4. White would love to recapture with a pawn. Strategically, that would be the correct decision. To regain control over the e5 square, white is ready to push the pawn forward and break the blockade. but it doesn't work because the rook is unguarded. Black has a tactical idea. He can capture on e4, and if the knight captures, the rook would fall and black would simply be up the exchange and the pawn. So white would be forced to capture with a bishop in this case, but black can temporarily sacrifice the exchange. The knight would capture, after which black gets the exchange back and ends up with an extra pawn. And a very important, valuable, central pawn is lost. For this reason, after Pilnik captures on f4, white cannot recapture with a pawn. So he captures with the bishop. And that's of course a strategic concession. Now white doesn't have a pawn which would have controlled this important square. And only the bishop controls it, but of course black bishop and the rook controls it, so this square is under black's control. But it turns out that black cannot now play this knight takes e4, which I have just shown you, which would be the case had white captured with a pawn instead of the bishop. That would be a mistake, because after knight takes e4, this time, now that his bishop is very active on this diagonal, white can simply sacrifice the exchange, knight takes e4, and letting black capture the rook, but getting a devastating attack after bishop g5, attacking the queen, putting enormous pressure on the crucial f6 square. And what can black do? His queen is under attack. The only square she has is d7. She cannot capture on d5 because of knight f6 check with the discovered attack. Of course, black is losing the queen. So after bishop g5, instead of queen takes d5, if black plays f6, then white simply captures on f6, attacking the queen and the bishop. And after bishop takes f6, knight takes f6 check, white can either get back the exchange and continue his attack on the exposed black king, or even stronger, as computer recommends, queen c3, creating a terrible threat, the x-ray, knight g4 check, king g8, knight h6 checkmate is threatened, and there is nothing black can do. The engine shows checkmate, forced checkmate in 15 moves. So neither queen takes d5 nor f6 works, and if black plays queen d7, the only square the queen has, then that would be followed by bishop f6, attacking the bishop, threatening deadly queen h6, after which with checkmate, and there is nothing black can do. If he captures, of course, then after knight f6 check with a fork, black is losing the queen. So for this reason, as this variation has just shown, the pawn is untouchable. But there is no need to hurry. The pawn is restricted anyways. It cannot move forward, as the bishop together with the rook, now again we can see the idea behind rook e8, controls this square. So the pawn is restrained. And Pilnik plays in accordance with Nemcovic's teaching. He has a famous saying: first restrain, then blockade, and finally destroy. So the pawns have been restrained. Now the second stage will begin. One of them, the d5 pawn, is blockaded. Now it's time to blockade the e4 pawn. Let's see how Pilnik does that. First, he plays bishop a6, activating the bishop. Rook e1 follows, moving the bishop away from this diagonal, and also possibly supporting the advance of the e-pawn forward. So Euwe wants to move the e2 knight away from the rook's way, after which e5 might be possible. Queen e7, however, Pilnik increases the control over the crucial e5 square, and g4. The idea is to vacate the g3 square for the knight, so Euwe prepares knight g3, followed by the possible e5 advance. There is an unpleasant x-ray for black between the white rook and the black queen, but bishop e5, blockading the pawn. Euwe exchanges the bishops in order to force black to capture with the queen, and queens, as we have already mentioned, are bad blockaders. they can be easily kicked out. And the best way of doing that would have been, which Euwe gives in his annotations, would have been king h1. The idea is to vacate the g1 square for the knight, and via g1 the knight can be rerouted to f3. This is the idea, with a tempo, and after the black queen retreats, the e-pawn will move forward and the blockade would be broken. And black cannot let his opponent do it. For this reason, after possible king h1, the best move for black to avoid this knight maneuver would be to give up the bishop. Bishop takes e2. White would love to recapture with the knight in order to renew this threat, but it doesn't work because the knight would close the rooks away, the e4 pawn would fall, knight takes e4, with a fork, black is winning. For this reason, after bishop takes e2, white would be forced to capture with the rook, and in this case black can play knight b5, for example, after which most probably the knights would be exchanged and the knight would return to d6 and white would remain with a bad bishop against a great black knight, but still black can continue the resistance. His position would remain very passive, but white's position isn't absolutely lost. So king h1 followed by knight g1 with the idea of knight f3 would have been white's best idea, but instead Euwe plays knight g3. However, the knight doesn't have prospects on this square. It's restricted, of course, by the g-pawn. And rook e7 follows, vacating the e8 square for the c7 knight. The knight isn't doing much on this square, and besides that, opening the rooks, the queen's rook's way to the king side. Bishop f1. Euwe offers the exchange of his bad bishop for black's good bishop, and it's understandable that Pilnik avoids the exchange. Bishop c8. Bishop e2 follows, and bishop d7, taking the important square under control and opening way for the rook. Rook f1, putting pressure on the f file, and rook f8, defending the pawn. Euwe struggles to find an active plan, so he just all he can do is just to make waiting moves. So he plays queen c1 and knight e8. We will see the idea of this move. King h1, another waiting move by Euwe, and f6. Now we can see black's idea. f6 vacates the f7 square. So this knight is greatly placed on d6, it blockades the d-pawn, but this knight isn't doing anything. So black has vacated the f7 square for this knight, so probably he thinks about possible knight f7 later in the game, vacating the d6 square for the second knight, and from f7, after the black queen, which is a bad blockader, moves away from this square, the f7 knight will jump on e5. That might be the idea, but it's not easy to execute this idea, as we will see. Euwe makes another waiting move, rook g1, and all commentators, all annotators of this game now recommend this idea, knight f7, followed by knight d6 and knight e5, but it doesn't work, because white can simply return to the f file, attacking f6, and black cannot play knight d6 because f6 is under attack. So the best thing he can do is to return the f knight to d6 to defend the pawn, and his knight is still passively placed on e8. For this reason, Pilnik doesn't hurry with knight f7. Instead, he plays knight g7. At first sight, it isn't clear what the knight is doing here. Probably it was a kind of waiting move, and it works, and it really worked, because Euwe makes another dubious move. He plays bishop f3. And we have reached another critical idea. Bishop f3 looks like another waiting move. We have reached another critical position. You can pause the video and try to find Pilnik's deep, counterintuitive, strategic idea. How to exploit these dark squares, the central squares, in the most effective way. So queens are bad blockaders. So Pilnik plays queen g5, eyeing the queen, offering the exchange of the queens, and also attacking the g4 pawn for the second time. So the best thing white can do is to exchange the queens. And at first sight, again, it seems that black made a positional mistake, because after the exchange of the queens, black is forced to capture with a pawn, and when the black pawn was on f6, it controlled the e5 square, and now after black captures, the pawn disappears from f6, and white gets the second passed pawn. Now he has two connected passed pawns. Besides that, black voluntarily doubled his own pawns. But all this isn't so important. It's much more significant that after the exchange of the queens, first the e5 square is vacated for the knight, and we will see how Pilnik will reroute the knight to this great square, to the ideal square. Besides that, after the exchange of the queens, white's possible chances for counterplay completely disappear, and the black king can safely move towards the center. And he can also contribute to the blockade on the dark squares. So Euwe plays rook f1, doubling on the open file. And now we can see how Pilnik is going to reroute the knight to this cherished square. Knight e8 is going to move the knight to f6, then the bishop is going to move away from d7, and via d7 the knight will jump on e5. Bishop e2 attacking the rook. A pair of rooks is exchanged, which is also in black's favor. King g, so black cannot play knight f6 right away, so first king g7, defending this square and moving the king closer to the center. h3, white still doesn't have any active plan. And knight f6. Euwe tries to break the blockade. He plays bishop f3, vacating the e2 square for the rook, and probably he thinks about rook e2, and the rook will support the advance of the pawn, and maybe he will manage to push the pawn forward, breaking the blockade. But bishop e8, vacating this square. Rook e2, white is ready to push the pawn forward, but knight d7. Again, the e-pawn is restrained, so it cannot move forward. Again, white must make passive waiting moves. Rook d2 and knight e5, the triumph of black's strategy. Both knights occupy the ideal squares and completely dominate the whole position. Not only blockading the pawns, but also, of course, supporting the advance, the upcoming advance of the pawn majority on the queen side. And with the tempo, attacking the bishop. The bishop must retreat, and now it's time, after completely blockading and almost paralyzing white, it's time to start the advance of the majority. b5, preparing the c4 advance. Rook c2, trying to stop the c-pawn, but rook c7, the black rook will support the advance. There is nothing white can do to stop it. Knight d1 and c4. b takes c, b takes c. As you see, both knights defend this pawn, and the rook doesn't actually need to stay on the c file. Knight c3, trying to blockade the pawn, and king f6. The king can safely move towards the cherished e5 square. We will see why it's so important. Knight b1 followed, and as the rook doesn't need to defend the pawn, there is a much more effective thing to do for this rook. So rook b7, occupying the open file with a tempo. Knight d2, Euwe attacks the pawn for the third time. So what should black do? Should he passively defend the pawn? Not, of course. He has the initiative. He must look for active moves. Bishop a4, attacking the rook. White has no time to capture the pawn, as his rook is under attack, and the rook must leave the second rank. The pawn is still under attack, but Pilnik makes another strong move, invading the second rank with a tempo and sacrificing the pawn. We will see why he sacrifices it. White accepts the sacrifice, he captures on c4. Now black must recapture. His rook is under attack, and black must make a decision. How should he capture, with the knight or the d knight? And it's much stronger to capture with the e knight, of course. First, this knight will remain on d6, blockading the d pawn. Also, this knight attacks the e4 pawn, and the knight has moved away from e5, vacating the square for the king. And the king, together with the d6 knight, will attack the weak e4 pawn, and after this pawn falls, the d5 pawn will fall too. So bishop takes c4 follows. Euwe exchanges his bad bishop. I'm sorry, no, he simply recaptures. And another strong move by Pilnik follows. Bishop c2. Closing the rook's file. Now the rook doesn't defend the bishop, and the bishop is under attack. But that's not the only idea. Besides that, the bishop also is eyeing the b1 square. We'll see why it's so important. White must save his bishop, and now rook b1, which leads to the exchange of the rooks. And it's important to exchange the rooks because the rook is one of the possible defenders of the weak e4 pawn. And after this exchange, and black has no choice, he must exchange the rooks. White is at the moment up a pawn, but both of his connected passed pawns are doomed. So the destruction stage begins now. There is no way to save the e4 pawn. It's attacked twice. If needed, black will attack it for the third time. So the e4 pawn is doomed. At least Euwe tries to hold the d5 pawn. He plays knight e2, hoping to defend the d5 pawn from c3. The e4 pawn falls, of course. Bishop takes e4 check, king h2. The king invades the cherished square, king e5. Attacking the d5 pawn for the second time, knight c3, defending the pawn, attacking the bishop, and Pilnik retains the valuable bishop, bishop d3. And it turns out that the d5 pawn is doomed anyways. Black is going to play king d4, kicking out the knight, after which bishop e4 would follow and the pawn will fall. For this reason, Euwe, as there is nothing he can do to save the pawn, at least tries to activate his king, king g3. But now, knight e4 check. Pilnik forces the exchange of the knights and transitions into the bishop endgame with an extra pawn. Of course, his extra pawn is doubled, and it isn't so valuable. However, as we will see, he has another significant positional advantage. So the pawn is doomed anyways, that's why Euwe pushes it forward to force black capture it with a king, so that the king moves a little bit away from the center. And now we can see what's black's real advantage is, the positional advantage, not the extra pawn. White bishop is bad. All white pawns, as you see, are on the light squares, on the same color as the bishop, while the black bishop is very strong and active. Besides that, the black king is much more active, and he is centralized, much more active than his white counterpart. So bishop g8 follows, attacking the pawn, h6, bishop f7, bishop d5, attacking the bishop and the pawn. Of course, exchanging the bishops leads to a hopeless pawn endgame. That's why Euwe captures on g6. He hopes to survive the bishop endgame, but bishop takes a2, creating a passed pawn. But let's see what happens next. h4 follows, and Pilnik pushes the passed pawn forward. H takes g, h takes, king f3, a4, king e3, bishop e6, attacking the pawn and moving the bishop away from the pawn's way. That's why white doesn't have time to defend the pawn, because after a3, the king doesn't have time. He isn't in time to stop the pawn. Black promotes to the queen. That's why after bishop e6, king d4 follows to stop this pawn, letting black capture. But still there is a trap. After king c3, bishop d1, defending the pawn and moving away from the g-pawn's way, bishop f5 follows. And it turns out that black cannot actually push the pawn forward, because white would sacrifice the bishop, and that would lead to a theoretical draw. But king e5 follows with a tempo, centralizing the king. Bishop retreats to d7, king f4, king b4. Still, g4 would be a terrible blunder after bishop takes g4, king takes g4, king a3. So the black bishop has the wrong color. In order to win this, black needs the dark squared bishop, the bishop which would control the promotion square of the pawn. So with the light squared bishop, it's a drawn position. Of course, Pilnik doesn't make this terrible mistake. Instead of pushing the pawn forward, he plays bishop c2, king c3, bishop b3, king b4, bishop f7. So he needs to kick the white bishop away from this diagonal so that his pawn can move forward, sacrificing the a pawn. But bishop g6, king b4, bishop f5. So the white bishop must move away. After it does, the g pawn moves forward. King c5, bishop e4. So now the bishop is kicked out of this diagonal, so that the pawn can move forward. Bishop d7, g3. Black is threatening to push the pawn forward. The only move is bishop h3, king e3, preventing king d4 and moving towards f2, king d6, and another strong move, bishop f5, to deflect the white bishop. If white captures, of course, the pawn moves forward, so bishop g2 follows, but now with the tempo, king f2, and the bishop must retreat, and after it retreats, black can play bishop g4, followed by bishop f3, and again the pawn will promote. For this reason, after king f2, in this position, Euwe finally resigned. And now I recommend watching a game where Alexander Alekhine employs an even more imaginative knight strategy to create an attacking masterpiece. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.